Hello, everyone, and welcome to Uncivil Law, where we learn through the misfortunes of others. As always, I hope you enjoy this legal education content, and today is the day I earned that subscription. For today's story, we are dealing with Harvey Weinstein. As you will recall, Harvey Weinstein was a Hollywood producer, a very famous one, who was the golden ticket for many a starlet. Well, how many a starlet got their roles has been somewhat exposed because Harvey Weinstein, it seems, was sexually coercive to many of them. And yeah, so he's been on trial for various criminal offenses relating to these things, previously convicted and recently convicted again by an LA jury. So we're going to cover the tale of Harvey Weinstein and his downfall from society. Let's get started with this. Jurors in the Harvey Weinstein sexual assault trial deadlocked on aggravating factors prosecutors had sought for disgraced film producers for a 2013 rape of a woman in her Beverly Hills hotel room. The Los Angeles County Superior Court judge declared a mistrial on two factors, ending a nearly 2-month-long trial that included 9 full days of jury deliberation. She tentatively has scheduled the sentencing for January 9th. Weinstein faces 18 years in prison, in addition to 23 years he's already serving for 2 sex crimes convictions from his 2020 New York trials. The aggravating factors would have added an additional 6 years. Prosecutors argued Tuesday that the woman he convicted of Monday of 3 crimes for raping were particularly vulnerable, and his attack required planning, sophistication, and professionalism. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what's going on. So different statutes are written differently, right? And there's different degrees of various statutes, sometimes with subcategories. So when you sexually assault someone, this can come in a variety of different levels of sexual assault. And even within levels, there can be levels, right? So you think about, and this also applies for other crimes as well, it's not just sexual assault, but murder, burglary, arson, just basically pretty much every offense you know of, right? You can have first degree, second degree, third degree, misdemeanor versions of it, depending on what it is, right? And within it as well, sometimes you'll see things that the legislature writes in sentencing enhancements. They're like, okay, if you're convicted of this, then this penalty. But if also this, then this add-on. Like, so a typical add-on would be using a gun in the commission of a crime. That would be an example of a typical add-on. So like you committed an armed robbery. Did you also do it with a firearm, right? So that would be 2 different things, right? You use some sort of arm of force, some sort of weapon, some sort of coercion to commit the armed robbery. One question. Second question, did you do it with a gun? If so, additional time. Well, the US Supreme Court clarified about a decade ago that all these aggravating factors, when they're provided for by the statute, have to be found by a jury, right? It's an enhancement. It's an enhancement provided for by the statute. So the jury has to find guilt as to each and every factor, each and every element of the charge. So when you're charged with, sexual assault, there's a series of elements. Here are the things that have to be true. It's like, if that's true, then great. Now, is this additional thing true? The jury has to find that beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's what they're talking about. The jury found guilt for the rape, but did not find the enhancements. So they didn't find that they were particularly vulnerable. They didn't find that the schemes were used particular sophistication to execute. Like, for example, like a white collar fraud might be, requires a lot of scheming and pushing a paper. Now, that's not obviously completely inapplicable to this context. I was just giving an example of where you might see a sophisticated scheme, right? So the jury was unable to find those factors. So as a result of it, you don't get the 6 additional years, only up to 18, plus the 23 he's already serving. And because they are separated offenses, they'll be served one after the other, which means he's going to die in prison. So, because he's old and he's not in great health in the first place. So, yeah, he's spending the rest of his life in prison. So they didn't get the enhancement, but, in some senses, it was more symbolic than practical, but let's read more. The first witness who testified when the trial began October 24th described sitting in his shower for hours and crying after the assault and the guilt and fear and shame that she felt. Remember the circumstances she was in. She was from a different country that was far away. She was part of a different culture. English was her third language, and in 2013, it wasn't that strong. Thompson told the jurors to consider what she was doing when Weinstein showed up in her hotel room in 2013. She had undressed. She had gotten into her robe. She had taken off her makeup. She had let her guard down, he added, adding to the jurors that they consider their own factors for vulnerability based on evidence. Weinstein's lawyers reminded jurors the standard isn't vulnerable. It's particularly vulnerable, which, fair enough. Let's start with something we can all agree on. Rape is bad. I think we can agree on that much. All victims of rape have suffered a grievous wrong, but not all rape is of a vulnerable victim, and not all victims are particularly vulnerable, which, fair enough as far as it goes, right? We as a society have decided that not all rapes, and for that matter, not all murders, not all burglaries, not all arsons, not all any offense are equally bad. There are different gradations of bad, depending on a whole number of factors. So they're not all equally bad. So if we're going to make that determination, as we have as a society in pretty much every domain of crime, right? There are different levels of crime. Then this is not necessarily the top level. It must be possible it's not the top level. So is she particularly vulnerable? I mean, without more, it's reasonable for the jury to deadlock on that factor. That's what they're talking about. She is a victim that fits within a standard universe of rape law, not an aggravating factor. She's 34 years old, physically fit, a dynamic woman who testified that she was especially well known in Italy, where she was a model and actress. So, she was not particularly vulnerable. She wasn't feeble. She wasn't under the influence, apparently. She wasn't a minor. So none of those or particularly aged. So none of those factors. She was in her own hotel room, in a hotel she stayed in many times. She had many friends and professional colleagues at or near the hotel. This would be a different story if the rapist was a hotel employee with a master key who stuck into the room. She let him in. She had a choice. She didn't have to open the door because she thought she could control the situation, which again, you could disagree that one's more evil than the other, but breaking and entering is typically considered to be worse. That's considered to be an additional thing. So he wasn't in that position. So he didn't, he didn't sneak in when she was asleep or something where she'd be vulnerable. She let him in. So this does fit more within that story. That's, a fair argument. It's also something you could disagree with, depending on your viewpoint, but it's a reasonable position. Regarding planning and sophistication, the attorney said that Jane Doe's testimony that Weinstein left his jacket in a room is the opposite of sophistication, planning, and professionalism. There's no planning, no timeline, no communication before or afterwards. Yeah, so there's no scheme that you can show that this was part of a coordinated plan. This was more of a attack of opportunity than something that was planned or thought out in some sort of laborious detail. Weinstein's tentative sentencing will include victim impact statements from only Jane Doe 1 after the judge rejected prosecutors' requests to include the women who testified as prior bad act witnesses, and to include Jane Doe 5, who Weinstein had been charged with 4 crimes that prosecutors never presented to the jury and were eventually dismissed. I'm not going to make this into an open forum on all allegations that were presented at trial, which, fair enough, right? The victims of this particular crime are not necessarily all of Weinstein's victims. He wants the people who are victims of this particular crime, which, different judges have a different taste for such things. And different states have different tastes for such things, as their rules allow for. But this judge wanted to keep it more constrained to this particular case to prevent it from becoming a truly open forum and allowing perhaps the prosecution to sneak in things that might cause an enhancement, which arguably could be a basis to overturn the trial, or at least overturn the sentence, right? By letting in these things that are unrelated. It would be a way to sneak them in and therefore a basis of appeal. So the judge is playing it a little bit more conservatively, but a reasonable decision, even if different judges, particularly in different states with different rules, might play it differently. Jurors acquitted him of sexual battery by restraint of Jules Bindi, a Hollywood masseuse who said that Weinstein touched her breast while self-pleasuring himself in front of her after a massage in 2010. Bindi said she confided in a friend, referring to actor Mel Gibson, but prosecutors never called him as a witness. Jurors hung on Weinstein's 3 other charges, as well as a misdemeanor charge prosecutors included as a lesser alternative to the sexual battery. They split 10-2 in favor of guilt on the sexual battery by restraint involving Jane Doe 2. They split 8-4 in favor of guilt for forced oral pleasure and forcible rape of Miss Newman, who is the wife of the California governor. Thus, that brings us to the end of this tale about Harvey Weinstein, who turns out is not a very nice guy. Turns out he might have used some of his Hollywood influence in perhaps ways that are less than fully wholesome, and sordid and compromised ways in some respects, it appears. Well, he's been convicted of assaults in New York, 23 years, and now convicted in LA for assaults that will carry up to 18 years. And because he's 70 years old, yeah, he's going to die in prison. So he gets to live out his golden years at Uncle Sam's expense. So perhaps bringing an end to this particular sordid tale of Hollywood corruption. And that brings us to the end of discussion of this case.